Jerusalem. In the year 66 AD, tensions are rising in the city. The Judeans, who've called this land their home for thousands of years, have been under the rule of the Romans ever since the famous general Pompey the Great conquered the city back in 63 BC. Over the generations of occupation, the Jewish people have become more and more indignant to Roman rule, and the people are ready to fight. And all it takes is one small incident of some Greeks sacrificing some birds in front of a local Jewish synagogue to cause one of the temple leaders to cease his sacrifices for the emperor. And from that moment on, things will snowball into a war lasting 8 years, with some of the most brutal back and forth fighting in the ancient world. And that will leave the Jewish people not only without their beloved temple, but also without a home. Hello there everyone. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the first major conflict between the Jews and the Romans, which took place between the years 66 and 74 AD. It was back in 63 BC, around 120 years before this time, that the famous Roman general Pompey the Great had come to the east and conquered Judea. And when he entered the city of Jerusalem, he went so far as to actually enter the Holy of Holies, which is the inner sanctuary inside the sacred temple in Jerusalem, after his troops had already stormed and looted the temple. This was at the end of a civil war between two brothers that Pompey's client ended up winning. So, pretty much from the get-go, the relations between the Jews and the Romans have not been good. And over the generations of Roman rule, it's only gotten worse. Over the years, they faced abuses from corrupt Roman governors and the rising religious tensions, as well as protests about taxation, and of course, the age-old issue of a growing wealth gap between the aristocracy and the less wealthy masses. As much as this was a war between the Jews and the Romans, it was also a civil war between two factions of Jewish groups. One that was for the rebellion, and another group, the group of Jews that had worked with and had been put into their positions of wealth and power by the Romans. So when the war finally broke out, one of the first acts of the rebels was to actually rid Jerusalem, and anywhere they could, of any Jewish people that they thought were sympathizers, or that had helped or worked with the Romans in any way. And all you really get from the text, they just say that a great loss of life occurred when the rebels swept through their own lands, finding people they deemed as traitors. Now, what initially actually kicked it all off, alongside all of the other issues going on at the time, was actually quite a small and what me and you would consider a pointless and stupid incident. But back in these times, people really, really believed in what they believed in. I'm quite confident in saying that nowadays, even if you do consider yourself a religious person, you're not gonna put your life on the line or go out and try and end somebody else's because of something somebody said or did. Of course, we do have some extremist groups around the world that would do that, but in today's day and age, I think most of us think that those people are religious fanatics. Well, back then, around 2000-ish years ago, give or take, everybody was like that. They truly, truly believed in their gods and traditions and religions. So when in the year 66, some Greeks, who just seemed to be fucking around and trying to piss off the Jews, well, they started sacrificing some birds while standing on a chamber pot just outside the entrance to a Jewish synagogue in the port city of Caesarea, which would have made the building ritually unclean and therefore unusable to the Jews. Well, in response to this, the Jews sent a group of men to the procurator of Judea, Gessius Florus. Now Gessius, he's only in this position because of his wife and her friendship with the Emperor Nero's wife. So he's not the most diplomatic and didn't really know what the hell he was doing. I mean, ever since he had taken his post in Judea, he had really been favoring the Greek population over the Jewish one. This, in turn, let the Greeks feel more emboldened and to not fear repercussions for doing things like sacrificing some birds in front of a Jewish synagogue. So the petitioners go to Gessius and actually had to pay him 8 talents just so that he would actually even hear their plights. But after getting the money, Gesius just straight up ignores the men. Well, actually, no. No, he doesn't ignore them. He arrests and imprisons the petitioners. And then this fucking guy, Gesius, takes another 17 talents from the temple treasury in Jerusalem and tells the Jewish people that, oh, this is just actually for the emperor, so don't worry about it, it's cool, don't be mad about this. And just a quick side note here, a talent was supposedly around 6,000 dinars, so basically $6,000 was what a talent was, and this dude was out here stealing 25 of them. And now this was the final straw. A temple clerk by the name of Eleazar ben Hananiah stopped offering prayers and sacrifices for the emperor at the temple, and attacks on Roman citizens and the so-called traitors started to become more and more frequent. And it seemed like the city of Jerusalem was going to fall into anarchy. It's actually said that the people of Jerusalem started to pass around a basket to collect money in a sort of a mocking way, to mock Gesius and insinuate that he was poor. And Gesius, of course, responded to the unrest by sending in troops and gathering up the leaders of the riots. He had them whipped, and then he crucified them. But yeah, that only made the situation worse, obviously, because shortly after this, groups of armed Jewish people began to gather, and when they were ready, they attacked and overran the Roman garrison stationed inside the city, and slaughtered them all. And once done with cleansing Jerusalem, the rebels then systematically went through the country and removed any sign of Roman authority or Rome at all. And it was actually at this time that the Sicarii rebels, another faction of Jewish rebels, surprised the Romans at Masada and took that fortress. But we shall get to that a little bit later. The commander of the garrison that was stationed on the west side of Jerusalem, much smaller garrison, that man's name was Metellus. He and his men were completely surrounded, so they offered to surrender if they were allowed safe passage outside of the city and Judea. But when they gave up their weapons, the Jews, led by Eleazar, surrounded them and killed all of the soldiers except for Metellus, who was apparently forced to convert to Judaism. And to top it all off, the pro-Roman king, Herod Agrippa, and his family, they fled Jerusalem, leaving the city's Roman citizens to fend for themselves. Now it was bad in Judea. Greeks were attacking Jews, Romans were attacking Jews were attacking everybody, even themselves. Just random acts of violence were happening all over the country. So, with complete turmoil taking over the province of Judea, the Roman legate of the neighboring province of Syria, Gaius Cestius Gallus, was called upon. Cestius gathered together the legion of the 12th Fulminata, aka the 12th Thunderbolts, as well as having some different cohorts from the Legio III Gallica, Legio IV Silica, as well as some of the units from the Legio VI Ferrata, or otherwise known as the 6th Ironclad Legion. Fucking badass. And of course, the auxiliary and allied troops that the Roman armies always had alongside them. The Romans brought together about 36,000 men to really put up a show of force and to hopefully end this rebellion quickly so that they could get back to doing business like they like to. And initially, the campaign of Cestius, it was going wonderful. He captured Narbata and Sepphoris. Some cities did surrender without a fight. The army then continued forward to Acre, I believe that's how it's pronounced, easily taking that town, and then onward to Jaffa, where it said, under the orders of Cestius, 8,400 people were massacred. Just a little side note for the Romans, no big deal, just murdered 8,000 people, but we're just going to make a passing note in our history books about it. Moving on. After terrorizing the coast for a little bit, Cestius Gallus, same guy here, he turned his force inland and made his way to the city of Jerusalem, where he put the city under siege and then managed to gain ground and actually managed to get on top of Mount Scopus, which was more of like a large hill than a mountain that overlooked the city of Jerusalem. The picture you see here is a view of the old city from the top of Mount Scopus. But for some reason, probably a multitude of reasons, just after a 9-day siege, Gallus abandoned his attempt and withdrew his men, heading back towards the coast. His forces had taken losses in ambushes, not many, about like 500 or so, it said, but his siege engines, they had been damaged, and he was also worried about being cut off from his supply lines, because it was already October, and the cold rains, were starting to fall. Now, the entire time the Roman force was retreating back to the coast, they were followed by the Judean rebels, who would try and catch any stragglers that strayed too far behind the main force. And it was as the Roman army entered into, and then was almost fully within a narrow passage near the small town of Beth Horon, that the rebels launched their first major attack. A group of Jewish zealots, led by Eleazar ben Simon, and a large group of Jewish peasants, led by Simon Bar Giora, ambushed and trapped the Roman army inside the passage of Beth Horon, where they rained down missile fire from above until they ran out of ammo, and then sent in a huge force of Judean infantry. Unable to form any coherent ranks to fight back against the rebels, and being wounded and tired, the men of the Roman army were no match for their attackers. The Judean rebels inflicted one of, if not the worst, loss suffered by a Roman army in a rebellious province in the history of the empire. Around 6,000 soldiers lost their lives, while the rest of the army all fled in disarray. Gallus, he did manage to escape, but at the cost of his army and most of the money and the loot that he had gathered along the way, and very shortly after leaving Syria, he would pass away. While Gallus and the survivors fled, the rebels searched the battlefield and stripped the dead of their armor and weapons. And when the news of the Jewish victory circulated through the land, many, many, many more volunteers all throughout Judea threw in their lot with the rebellion. In fact, the Romans were so thoroughly beaten and kicked out of Judea that for the first time in a very long time, a Jewish government was in charge of Jerusalem. But in just 2 short years, the people in charge of the Judean provincial government will find themselves besieged inside the temple of Jerusalem by Jewish zealots. But I digress there. I should cover that event either in this video or a future one, depending on how long this one takes. Now that the rebellion was in full swing, the Jews appointed leaders to the new government, as well as various commanders for the different cities they'd need to defend against the Romans when they came back. But before that happened, the rebels were feeling quite confident after their success at the Battle of Beth Horon. So 3 men, Niger the Perean, Johanan the Icean, and Shila the Babylonian, gathered together a force of Jewish militia and attempted to take the town of Ashkelon, which this whole time had stayed loyal to Rome, and actually still had a very small Roman garrison in it. But this attack completely failed, and 2 of the 3 leading men were killed in battle, along 6,000 of their soldiers. Niger, the Perean, was the one leader to make it out alive, and on top of all that, after the battle, the Greeks and Romans in the town began to attack and execute the Jews that were still left in the city. And this whole ordeal, it made the Jewish leadership back in Jerusalem rethink a strategy of instead of trying to take more cities and gain land against the Romans, they switched to a defensive strategy focused much more on just holding the stuff that they actually had and making it all about fortified warfare. Now, it was sometime after this defeat that the Sicarii leader, Menahem ben Yehuda, the Sicarii are the ones I talked about earlier, the super extreme portion of the Zealots, the ones that took the fortress of Masada from the Roman garrison there, these guys, they were nuts. They would kill anybody that they deemed as a Roman sympathizer. At one point, they actually massacred a Jewish settlement called En-Gedi. They killed 700 of their fellow Jews, and it doesn't say why. But they must just not have conformed to the view of Judaism that the Sicarii did. And unluckily for them, they were a small enough group of Jews that the Sicarii thought they could just get away with disposing of, and Well, they did. And like I said before, as much as this war is between Jews and Romans, it was very much a war between Jewish people over differing opinions on what it actually meant to be a Jew and who you actually followed. Now, we reach the year of 67 AD, and the news of the happenings going on in Judea have reached all the way back to Rome and the imperial ruling family, which at this time was headed by the infamous Nero. Nero was too busy being a weirdo to deal with the rebellion himself, so he called upon a very talented general from an equestrian family by the name of Vespasian. Vespasian had an extensive military career and was very well distinguished in war. He had even taken part in the Roman invasion of Britain back in 43 AD, just over 2 decades before. Under his command was 2 full legions, the 10th Legio Fretensis, aka the 10th Legion of the Straits, and the 5th Legio Macedonica. And when he arrived in Ptolemy in the spring, his son Titus met him there after bringing the 15th Legio Apollinaris, aka Apollo's 15th Legion, from Alexandria. Now this gave Vespasian over 60,000 men at his disposal to try and take back the province of Judea. Now in the north of Judea, Galilee specifically, there were 2 groups of Jews. The first camp, led by a man named Yosef ben Mattiyahu, was loyal to the provincial government back in Jerusalem, and was made up mostly of the wealthier and priestly class of Jews, and of course the Zealots, who were mostly made up of the farmers, fishermen, and peasant classes of Judea. Now this Ben fellow, he's going to be a major player in the story, and eventually history. Ben was a Jewish man born into one of the most elite families in Jerusalem. His father was a high priest, while his mother actually descended from the former ruling family of Jerusalem, the Hasmoneans. And in his 20s, he actually went to meet with Emperor Nero himself to try and persuade him to release some Jewish priests that he was holding prisoner. And when the war broke out in Judea, it was Ben who was appointed commander of Galilee. And it's actually said that he did pretty decent. He fortified several different towns, and he tried as best as he could to prepare for the advancing Romans. But inevitably, he found himself stuck inside the walls of a city called Yodfat, as the Romans were just about to smash their way in. Vespasian and his army had been making their way south from the north of Judea, easily taking towns and cities along the way. Actually, there were some towns that gave up without a fight and immediately turned themselves over to the Romans. And it wasn't until the army reached the hilltop town of Yodfat, where our friend Ben Mattiyahu and his defenders were waiting. After a failed attack on the walls during the second day, Vespasian ordered his men to get stuck in, because they were going to have themselves a proper siege. Of course, as the Romans were building their siege weapons, the defenders would sally out and try and stop them. And that happened all the way up until Vespasian had 160 catapults and ballistas set up behind the workers, protected by a bunch of archers and slingers that would shoot at anything that they saw move on the walls of Yodfat. Vespasian had also ordered that a ramp be built against the walls so that a battering ram could be brought up to create a breach. The defenders of Yodfat tried absolutely everything they could to stop this from happening. They lowered bags filled with chaff in front of the battering ram to soften the blows against the walls, and that worked until the Roman soldiers were able to tear them down. I mean, they sallied out from behind the walls multiple different times to try and set the ram on fire, but each time were beaten back. There's even a recorded event that a particularly strong Jewish defender picked up a massive stone and managed to throw it over the walls, where it landed on the head of the ram, actually breaking it off. The fighting was so fierce and in such close quarters that even Vespasian himself was hit with some sort of a dart weapon. But this just pissed the Roman soldiers off even more, so that they continued their attack on the walls all throughout the night, and eventually made a breach in one of the walls. But when they tried to surge through the gap and climb the walls at the same time, the defenders poured boiling oil all over the men, climbing the walls, and then charged forward into the breach themselves to stop the Romans from getting through. And once more, the Jewish defense was able to push back the Roman infantry. At this point, Vespasian ordered the 3 large siege towers to be built, and that the ramp be built so high that it was actually higher than the walls of Yodfat themselves. And with the cover provided by the siege towers, the Roman engineers were able to build the ramp up until it did actually surpass the height of the walls. And it was at this time, on the 47th day of the siege, that a traitor deserted the defense and went over to Vespasian and told him of how bad it was inside the walls, and that there was actually barely anybody left in there defending, so much so that everybody actually fell asleep during the latest night watch because the men inside the walls were all just so tired. So before dawn broke the next day, a group of Roman soldiers, apparently led by Titus himself, Vespasian's son, stealthily scaled the walls of Yodfat and slit the throats of the men who were sleeping on watch. Then they made their way to the gates and let in the rest of the Roman army. The Jews, caught by surprise, had no chance. 40,000 people are said to have been slain, while another 1,200 women and children were taken into slavery, while the Romans are said to have just lost 1 man. Now, Yosef ben Mattiyahu and some of the leadership, they were still alive. They were actually held up in one of the many caves that were around the city. He was trapped in a cave, in there with about 40 other people, most of the leadership of Yodfat, and he actually wanted to surrender to the Romans. But his companions were having none of that. They thought it'd be much better to die than to fall into the hands of the Romans. So Ben proposed that they actually take turns killing one another. And they couldn't do it themselves because that would be considered sinful. So one by one, the men took turns offing one another, until it was just Ben and one other man left. They both looked at each other and were like, yeah, fuck this, yeah, let's go surrender. I'm not dying in this cave. So they did. And when Ben was taken to see Vespasian, he came up with the idea that he would tell the Roman general that he knew of a prophecy that pointed to him, Vespasian, as the next emperor of Rome. Vespasian, liking what he was hearing from the rebel leader, decided that he would actually let him live, and that he would accompany him on his campaign through Judea. Ben, on his part, began to work with Vespasian and the Romans, even being the negotiator during the upcoming siege of Jerusalem, which his parents were being held hostage in. In fact, Ben will become so intertwined with Vespasian and the Flavian dynasty that he creates, that he will eventually end up becoming a sort of official historian for the Roman ruling family during his life. And it's actually his works that historians and myself have used to try and determine what was going on at this time in history. Ben will eventually be granted Roman citizenship and rebrand himself as the Roman historian Flavius Josephus. And in part 2 of the First Roman and Jewish War, we will continue to follow him and the Flavian family as they try and bring the province of Judea back under Roman rule. Now I'm very curious, actually. I wonder if there's anyone that can tell me this in the comments or anything like that. I'm very curious as to see how Josephus is portrayed nowadays. Not just as a Roman historian or anything, but like, what do the actual Jewish people think of him? Do they think of him as a traitor? As a bad person? Because the way I've seen it so far, dude's freaking snaky as hell, man. Guy's just backstabbing everybody, freaking completely betraying everyone, and whatever the hell his apparent beliefs are. So I don't know if anybody can let me know, like, how he's actually portrayed in the Jewish community and what they think of him. That would be very, very interesting to learn. But that's the end of this part one of the Roman-Jewish War, the first major conflict between the Romans and the Jews. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.